I'm joined now by Dr. Denise Barden, who's Associate Professor within the University of Southampton Business School. She spent many years exploring Cuba and the leadership styles and contrast between Fidel and Raul Castro. A very good afternoon to you. Is this so? I mean, the headlines, end of an era, things are going to change, etc. Is it the end of an era?
Oh, it certainly is. I think Fidel Castro must be the longest political leader, 5 decades. He was in power, so it is the end of an era, yes.
You've been looking at the leadership styles between the two brothers, but let's look at Fidel Castro first of all. He ruled with an iron fist, didn't he?
Well, that's something everyone's fond of saying, but when I talk to the people who live in Cuba and the Cubans who've come to live in the UK, that's not the story that I get. The feeling that comes through is of Fidel Castro almost as a father figure. So the older generation tend to see him as a hero of the revolution. They're aware that many of them wouldn't even be here if it wouldn't have been for the health advances and the sort of equalisation of resources that he provided. It's mostly, I think, the newer generation who were born under the special period when it was chronically poor with the embargo, Soviet withdrawal of funds, and some of them blame Fidel Castro for the hardships they went through, but some of them blame the US embargo. But by no means is Fidel Castro held to blame by most people of Cuba. I think most people blame the embargo.
But what about, I mean, how do you rationalise that with his human rights record?
Well, you see, that's quite interesting as well. Again, you talk to Cubans, many of them say, I'd rather be in a Cuban jail than Guantanamo Bay. And when I was talking to a Cuban who left Cuba, and I always ask about this human rights issue, and she said, oh yes, you can't always speak freely. She talked about her neighbour. I said, well, what's the worst thing you can think of? And she talked about a neighbour who used to get drunk and run out in the streets screaming, I hate Fidel Castro. And she said police would pick him up and he'd be put away, but he'd be back again the next day. They'd let him go. A few months later, he'd do the same again. They'd pick him up, they'd give him back. And when I went to talk to people in Cuba, I found it remarkable how freely they all spoke about Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and the policies. I was expecting, you know, from the discourse we hear, that people would be afraid to speak out, and that wasn't what I found. People
Did they speak out, though? Did they speak out? Did they criticise the regime?
Oh, yes. I had the head of a topical newspaper who was quite critical of the government in some ways, not always, but some ways. And I think what it is, the media has been dominated by America. So, for example, when Obama visited Havana, you had the Cuban ladies in white come out to protest against the human rights abuses. And so, of course, that dominates the headlines. But they're paid for by Americans. People don't realise that. An American agency pays for them. Yeah, but the Cubans don't take them seriously.
Yeah, but he did carry out human rights abuses. Look, even let's just take one section.
Yes.
Gay people and those with AIDS, completely persecuted.
I think when you look back at the time at which the revolution was considered to be a little bit homophobic, which was in the 60s, I'm not sure many countries could hold their heads up high and say that they were as open as they should be. So I think you have to look at it in context of the period as well.
You seemed quite fond of Fidel Castro, if I could put it that way.
I think what it is, I'm one of these people who've listened to all these news broadcasts, who's been exposed to the Miami voice as the very dominant voice. And I think I was just surprised when I went there not to find this browbeaten people who felt oppressed. Most of them are very, very proud to be Cuban. They loved and admired Fidel Castro. Not all of them, by all means. But even those who were critical of his policies couldn't hate him. They all thought he was well-intentioned, had integrity. And I think that made me a little bit cross, actually, because I think we've been exposed to a lot of misinformation, and this quite small minority in Florida has dominated the headlines today and over the past 50 years.
So are you saying that what he did, the things that we would see as a human rights abuse, was okay?
Well, do you want to be more specific?
Well, the prisoners, the political prisoners, the problems with gay people, etc., etc.
No, I don't think political prisoners are ever okay, and I don't think persecuting gay people is ever okay. What I'm disputing is that Fidel Castro or Cuba was any worse than any other country. I think if you expose America to the same lens, I think you'd have a stack of crimes that would overshadow what Fidel Castro has done. I think the important thing to realise is the moment Fidel came into power in the revolution, at the time in which there's very strong anti-communist feeling, the Americans did everything they could to subvert that. They invaded in the Bay of Pigs. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a response to an expected additional invasion. And there was, I think, an estimated 638 CIA-sponsored attempts on Fidel Castro's life. So I think you have to understand the responses and the fear of open speech in the context of a constant aggression coming from 90 miles over the water.
Dr. Denise Barden, good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.